Well, hi, everybody. I'm Larry Jacobs. This is Pre-K-12 Education Talk Radio. It's our second show today on the 20th of September, 2023, and thank you for being here with us. We've got Joe Feldman here today. Joe is the Chief Executive Officer of a very, very interesting educational organization called Crescendo Education Group, and I have it linked up here on site. All right, he's the founder, he's the CEO, and what they're concerned about is improving grading and assessment practices at colleges, at universities, and at K-12 schools and districts. And it has to do with what Joe will explain to us is called equitable grading. And he's going to tell us all about it, how they work with school districts, how they work with colleges as well. All right. And we'll talk about all this and why it really matters. And he actually wrote a book called Grading for Equity, what it is, why it matters, and how it can transform schools and classrooms. So I'll bring Joe on just about a minute. I just want to say we're going to archive the show over at ace-ed.org. That's the home website of our Consortium for Equity. There we go, in education. All right. And we work very hard for equity every day, and as such, we have our magazine over on the website, our online journal called Equity and Access. We archive all the podcasts over there. We have our Excellence in Equity Awards, plus a ton of information. It's all free, and it's at ace-ed.org, and we invite you to go over there and check it all out. Without further ado of me blabbing here, let me bring on Joe. Hi, Joe. It's Larry here. How you doing?
Hi, Larry. Good morning.
Good morning to you, sir. Where are you today?
I'm in Oakland, California, my home.
Wow. Far from here. I live in Maine. I'm all the way across the country from you, for goodness sakes. And thank you for being up so early and doing this.
Sure. We actually did some work with College of the Atlantic up in your neck of the woods.
There you go. There you go. Okay. Thank you for doing that. Okay. I appreciate it. And I love what you guys are doing. Again, I got it all linked here, Crescendo Education Group. Joe, I want you to just tell everybody what you do, what the group does, and brag a lot.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I'm a former teacher and principal and district administrator, and I worked in New York and Atlanta and Northern California, and in 2013 started
working your way west. Why you wait you? What can I say? You're working your way west from New York. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good to get your feet wet.
I started exploring grading. It was something that I just felt like I didn't really have a handle on, and for lots of reasons, it was a struggle among my teachers and among my colleagues, and found this rich history of grading in this country, and started to research and understand ways in which our traditional grading practices actually undermine a lot of effective teaching and learning and perpetuate achievement and opportunity gaps in our students without us even knowing it's happening. And so started finding ways in which we could make our grading more equitable, more accurate, more bias-resistant, and motivational. I'll talk about that in a minute. But, started partnering with schools and districts and started an organization that does that. So we work with, as you said, K-12 schools and districts and universities and colleges, all to help give teachers access to the research on how to grade more effectively and in ways that really improve all students' performance, particularly those who have been historically underserved.
Yeah, here. I couldn't agree with that. By the way, your organization, you know this, but I want people to know that, is gradingforequity.org. Gradingforequity.org. And I'm curious, I read a little bit on your website. I read actually quite a bit about everything on your website. And what I noticed was that, you make a special point of saying how important grading is as to what an educator does. That's the whole point, is to, get the kids grades and move them forward, et cetera, et cetera. Yet there's too little time in teacher training, the way I see it and the way I went through it years ago. Okay. Really, grading was, just take test scores, which I made up myself, the tests I made up myself, and then anecdotal and have classroom participation. Yet that's the summation of the child's work. That's the whole goal of the whole thing. Yet it's not something that we really take a lot of time to think about. That's why I love what you guys do. I hope I expressed that properly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we find is, just like what you experienced, when you were going through your teaching training, is that in graduate programs and in teacher certification programs, there is no support with how to grade. And yet, the irony is it's one of the most important things that we do as teachers, and it has huge implications for students, right? It's
absolutely.
Like, do I get to take the honors class? Do I get to participate in sports? Do I get to get this scholarship? I mean, big aspects that can affect their life trajectory. And the irony is that we don't get much training. So that's why teachers are just so hungry for this work.
And actually, I'm going to ask that question. When you go in and talk to a school district, you just said it, but I'd like you to get a little deeper in the weeds there. Okay, how hungry are they? Do they go, you're right, well, I don't know anything about this. I've been doing it for 15 years, and I still don't know anything about this. What's the reaction usually?
Yeah, well, we get lots of different reactions, and all very powerful ones. So sometimes, we don't get much training, and yet it's so important. Teachers spend an awful lot of time creating their grading system, and they fine-tune it, and they mostly are replicating how they were graded, right? A teacher did this for me when I was in school, so I'm doing the same thing, and they're kind of making it up as they go, but they've spent a lot of time. So when they're confronted with the information that the ways they're grading actually undermine their own work, some teachers are so thankful that they get the opportunity. Some are very resistant, like, wait a minute now, I'm a good teacher. You're suggesting that
you're not saying they're not a good teacher.
Grading.
Yeah, you're not saying they're not a good teacher. Yeah,
that's right. That's right. And what we try and do is just normalize it. This is you're not at fault for creating a system or replicating a system that's undermining your own work and hurting some kids, because you're just doing what you got. And so now you have the opportunity. And what we find is when teachers go through this work with us, it actually increases retention. We found that for the teachers that do this, we're filling a gap so that over 50% of them say they're more likely to stay in their district because of doing this work.
That's saying something. These days, it's always saying something, but saying something these days, it really matters. Okay, it really matters. And I want you to, you've said this 3 times now, I think, how bad teachers' own grading system, quote, could undermine, this is the quote, undermine their own work. What do you mean by that? That's a quote you've used several times. Yeah.
That's right. So traditional grading relies on a number of beliefs and sort of systems that were very important to us when the system was developed. And the system was developed in the Industrial Revolution 100 years ago, when we were very concerned about preparing students for work in the factories, where schools were really designed to sort students into those who are going to get a lot of resources and become the bosses and the college-going folks, and those who weren't going to get much support and go into the factories. We were also had particular ideas about what motivation was, very much behavioralism, the rat in the cage, and you want it to do something, so you give it food or you electrify the floor. And these ideas have been totally debunked in the last 50 years of research. And yet many of the practices that we use in grading have fossilized using these ideas. So I'll give you an example. One of the things that we do traditionally is we say, okay, we'll have homework, a quiz, and a test, let's say. That's a very simplified version of what happens in a class. Yeah. And traditionally what we do is we include how the student did on homework, that's graded, and then how they do on the quiz is graded, and how they do on the test is graded. And the problem is that we assign homework because we want students to have practice, right? We want them to make mistakes, or they're still in their learning stage. That's what's supposed to happen, and they learn from their mistakes so that by the time they get to the test or the final assessment, they do really well. Well, what we do, though, is that we are including those mistakes that they make in the homework in the grade calculation. So let's say I don't know anything about the Pythagorean theorem, and so that I get some homework and I make a bunch of mistakes, and so I maybe get 4 out of 10 or 6 out of 10, and then the quiz I do a little better, I get 80%, and then I have another homework on it and I get 6 out of 10 or 7 out of 10, and then finally I understand when it's time to the test, I get an A. And traditionally, because we're including all those prior practice kinds of assignments and exercises, the grade that I have as an A is probably pulled down to more like a B, because the grade is including all those prior mistakes in my calculation. So right. I might get a B. And then I might have another student who really did all the homework because they got a lot of help from a tutor, or, they did all that. But when it came time to the final assessment, they didn't really understand it very well. Maybe they got a C+. But because they've done all the stuff, their grade is actually lifted. So they have a B. So now you have two students, me and that other student. I know it really, really well, and the other student doesn't know it very well, but we have the identical grade. And in those ways, our traditional grading really warps the accuracy and makes it very difficult because we're including all this information and the prior mistakes. The grade doesn't actually help us with understanding where a student is in their learning. And that's just one example. And it not only warps the accuracy, but it makes grades more biased, because what happens is if I'm a student who went to a summer program where I learned about the Pythagorean theorem, I come in and I'm getting A's on every homework, every quiz, and then my final grade, of course, is an A, and so I have an A. But let's say I didn't go to that summer program because I couldn't afford it, or we couldn't get there, or I had to have a job. I come in not knowing the Pythagorean theorem. I make all those mistakes, which I'm supposed to make, by the way. That's what the practice is for. And I come in, and even though I learned it by the end, my grade is lower than that other student, even though we both have. So that's one example of how teachers using these traditional systems are actually not doing the things that they want to have happen in the classroom, and making it harder for students to be successful, and particularly if they have a weaker education background.
Yeah, and if you can make your students feel successful, you as a teacher feel successful. And I have to say, and if you're fair to your kids, you're fair to yourself, and what you said before, you're going to like your job a lot more. You're going to stay at it. Okay, to me, right. What you said about teacher retention and all this sort of stuff, it's really, really amazing. So the equitableness that you're talking about, okay, does it have to do at all? Maybe you see this with the race, gender, etc. Is that part of what you guys do? Does that build into this? I believe that somehow it does. But I'm just curious.
Yeah, so
when you use the word equitable. And I understand what you just said, and believe me, there is an inequity out there, because we measure a kid from the ghetto in a Philadelphia public school like where I went, okay, to its kid in a very good suburban school, all right, and they have trying to get into the same college, all right. So so talk to me about the grading and equity in terms of race, gender, socioeconomic. Have you seen bias or whatever in that?
Yeah. So, I'll say, first of all, I'm not an expert researcher on equity and culturally responsive pedagogy and those fields. But what I'm doing is I'm trying to bring those researchers, the Gloria Ladson-Billings and Lisa Delpit and Bettina Love into this work. So the ways in which we talk about it are, in the example I just gave, students who have had more systemic denial of access to education are likely to come into the class less prepared, even if they are more successful, right? So in that example I just gave, if I came in and I didn't understand the Pythagorean theorem for all kinds of reasons related to my race and my socioeconomic status, I would make it disproportionately harder for me to be successful. Right? So that's example one. And that goes to sort of the institutional biases that are happening outside our classroom in many ways. There's also things that happen within our classroom around our implicit biases. For example, many teachers traditionally use participation. You mentioned that actually as part of the grade calculation, right?
Yeah.
So is the student essentially acting in ways that show me that they are learning, or that I believe will help them to learn, right? So you're raising your hand, you're coming in on time, you're sort of speaking at the right volume, all those kinds of things. And teachers use all kinds of things to be participation. And oftentimes participation is really saying, I learn in certain ways, and I'm going to look for students to do the same thing, right? So there's kind of this archetype. And when you cross cultures around that, not every student learns the same, and students behave differently, and oftentimes we misinterpret student behaviors as sort of against learning or not the way we learned, even though it may work perfectly for them, right? So what we find is, and there's plenty of research on this, is that we see that teachers, when they use participation, they will inadvertently bring their biases in, which, particularly when the teacher is a white teacher, and most teachers are white, when they are looking at students of color or from different cultures, they will actually judge them differently and more harshly and not give them the same value in the participation points. And the reason why we don't want participation points is because it has these biases into it, and because the ways that kids act may have nothing to do with how they learn. And the only way to know whether or not students have learned is to assess them. So we talk about how equitable grading is where you exclude participation from the grade calculation, and it is only a reflection of what kids know, not how they act or their behavior.
Right. This is just so fascinating, and I love it. By the way, how did you figure all this out? Maybe I know you're a smart guy, and I know you got good people around you, but at some point, something must have happened that you saw, wait a minute, something's not right here. And like you said, you were superintendent, principal, all that sort of stuff. When did you see this and go, holy crow, I got to fix this?
Well, it really started happening when I was a principal, and I would see two teachers, let's say they were, two algebra teachers, for example, and they have the same textbook, they have the same training, their students essentially have the same profile and demographics, and yet the students have, the classrooms or those teachers have wildly different pass and fail rates, right? So in one class, you have 50% of the kids failing, and in another class, you have 10% of the kids failing in the same course. And as I started to explore more about, how could this be? I saw that it was in the ways they constructed their syllabi and the ways that they graded, right? So they would say things like, well, in this class, 20% of the homeworkers were 20% of the grade, but in that class, 40% is. Or in this class, you can turn things in late without a penalty, and in this class, the teacher doesn't accept it after one day. And this class has extra credit, and this class doesn't, right? So we don't want the grade to be reflective of the way the teacher grades. We want the grade to be reflective of the student's understanding of the course content.
Boy, that's a great quote.
Really and it just it's not the way it was supposed to be. So
no, it is not.
Really kind of started me interviewing more principals and teachers and researching.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. And, it's true. Kids always say, oh, I don't want Mr. Johnson. He's really tough. But Mr. Smith is really pretty easy. But they're both teaching the same course. Okay, right. How could this be? And you're right that, although teachers tend to close the door, quote, and have their own system, that's not the way it should be. That's not the way it works. Okay?
Right.
And for an administrator or a school district or whatever to say, no, you have to grade on a system that's fair. Okay? Regardless of what you're doing, we need to change the way you're thinking about this. Okay? That's heavy duty to a teacher. That's heavy duty.
It sure is.
Yeah, I mean, that's brutal. So talk to me, when you go in, to a school district or a college or whatever, especially college where professors are kings and queens of their domain, so to speak. It's up to them what they do. I could tell you stories from when I was in school, drove me crazy. Okay? To college. Tell me, what do you do when you go in? How do you solve that problem of we want to teach you to do something better, not change your life? Don't talk to me about that. Because you really do confront them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that, I write about in the book about how grading is one of the last islands of autonomy for teachers, that they, particularly in K-12, where and also in post-secondary, where
I would say post-secondary too,
Yeah, there are so many mandates and expectations placed on them, and the grade is one of the last ways in which they can bring their full professionalism and judgment about their students' performance. And nobody is in a better position to assign that grade than that teacher, right? In fact, there are regulations in different states and districts that protect the grade from being overwritten. It's so prized by teachers. And so, unfortunately, oftentimes in the past, teachers really resist any conversation about grades because, don't take that away from me, right? That is my professional identity that is really exemplified in the way I grade. And so we first start by really trying to normalize those feelings and that connection that teachers have to the grade. And then we explain and sort of expose that, you haven't had any training about this, so let's just start learning about this. Let's just be curious about why of all possible universes we have this grading system, and could there be another way, considering we've kept this system for the last 100 years? And I think part of this work is really helping teachers feel like it's okay to be curious about this aspect of our work. And it doesn't mean that you're not a good teacher, and it doesn't mean that you don't know what you're doing. It's just, we want our doctors to keep learning and getting better. We want our nurses and architects. We want the same of our teachers. And we as professionals, I think, need to be open to learning about new perspectives and new ways of doing our work.
Yeah, and there is, I have to say, we all talk about the science of reading, that sort of stuff these days. And there's a science of a grading too. Okay, we have to understand that. And which brings up the question, Joe, and you must have talked to college professors, schools of education. I assume the way you were talking that even today, and I went through teacher education about 12 million years ago, okay? There were only 20 letters in the alphabet. It was so long ago. And it's unbelievable. But what you're saying to me is basically, as far as grading, which again is the summation of the student's progress, that's what we're all about. It's still not being taught as a science, so to speak. All right, in teachers' colleges, am I wrong? Or what's going on? What are they? What the hell are they waiting for? Let me be blunt.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. What we've found is that overwhelmingly, it's still not talked about in colleges and training programs. Yeah, and I think partly because it's not, frankly, it's not real sexy. Right? It really is just, I think a lot of people think that it's just adding up the points, right? Like the real value is in curriculum design, in assessment design, what does my test look like? Not in, and I think people sort of write it off as like, well, if you made an assessment, it's 100 points. You put in, the kid got 84 points and you put in 84 in the grade. What's the big deal? And I think only now have schools started to do that. I think in part because of my book, fortunately. We've heard folks like Stanford School of Education, and there's other sort of professional programs that are trying to start using it. But it's still not there. And, I think because graduate schools don't have a lot of time with their teachers. And so there's so much to address, and the teacher programs are pretty short generally, and teachers are trying to get through that program so they can get a job because teacher pay isn't very much. There's all kinds of complex dynamics that are making it so, they're really shaving this off from the curriculum. But, I think teachers find that it's a really important part of their work.
It's an incredible part of the work, and I don't think I think they do, but I want to say this the right way. When you were discussing the implications of grading at the beginning of the show today, okay, I don't think we really, really, really down deep think about that implication, how important that grade is to the kid and how we measure it. Okay, there's a lot in there. Okay, there's a lot of stuff that goes into that grade. All right, and it's not fair that Mr. Smith gives the kid a C. It was just coincidental that the kid was assigned to Mr. Smith versus Ms. Jones. Okay, but look at the difference between the two, if I may, and we got to be careful about that. So talk to me what's actually happened. Give us some results of some of the things that you folks have done as you work with school districts. And I know you have them on your website, by the way. I want to say that again. I want to say this clearly. Crescendo Education Group doesn't they don't have the taillight warranty. When they drive out of the driveway, the warranty's done. Okay? They're measuring the outcomes of all this. You can't see the taillights anymore. The warranty's over. Okay? Not this way. Yeah, go ahead. Talk, Joe. Tell us about it.
In fact, when I first started this, I was doing a lot of research, and I was partnered with one school way at the beginning. This is 10 years ago, and started working with the teachers, and I didn't know if this would work because this was new ways of grading in many cases. And so at the very beginning, I hired an external evaluator to look and see whether it was working. And what we found from the very beginning, and has continued into this time, is that teachers are changing what they do as a result of this work. So we're seeing that, over the past, this is the data that we have prior to the pandemic, because the pandemic interrupted a lot of things. But we found that teachers were 19 times less likely to include tardiness or adherence to the class rules in the grade. Teachers are less likely to reduce points for work submitted late. They agree, they feel that there's less stress in the classrooms because of this work. And we can talk more about why that would be. But and teachers are saying that this has fundamentally changed what they do in classrooms. We've also looked at what's happening to the grades themselves, right? So teachers love this, and they're self-reporting that things are different. But what's actually happening with the grades themselves? And what we're finding is that the DNF rates go down, particularly for those students who have been historically underserved, English learners and students of color. And we ask the teachers after, we show them the data, and we say, look, you had a decrease in D's and F's. So what do you think would be an incorrect assumption that other people would make about this work? And they say, well, they'll think that because we were equitably grading, that we lowered our standards, that's what caused the DNFs. And I ask them, I say, well, what should I tell them? And the teachers say, you should actually say that it got harder. Our classrooms became more rigorous because now what we are doing is we are not saying, oh, you can just get these points from anywhere. We're saying that the grade only represents your learning, and you can't compensate for lack of learning by doing the extra credit points, right? Bringing in the cupcakes for the potluck or bringing in your syllabus signed or whatever, right? You have to actually learn. And because we were able to focus on it and because the students were able to focus on it, it made our classrooms more rigorous around our instruction.
Yeah. I remember when I was, I guess all through secondary school in Philadelphia, again, a million years ago. Okay. William Penn was with me in class. And, I remember they broke every grade. Every teacher had three things to mark down. It was the academic ability, behavior, and I can't remember what the third thing was. So like for social studies in 8th grade, I would get 3 grades, an A, a B, a C, let's say. Okay. And I wonder how serious they took that, because I don't think anybody ever did it anymore. I don't think it's done anymore. Okay. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, some schools have tried to think about, the things that I've talked about, like coming on time, right? So if that's not included in the grade, some schools feel like, well, we actually want to give a grade about it, but we'll make it a separate grade. So some schools will do just what you described. And some do it with real fidelity, and some are a little bit more like, how am I feeling as a teacher on the day that I signed
a lot of that goes. A lot of.
Yeah.
I always say this, a lot of what we do in teaching is with these kids is anecdotal. Okay, we get a sense of the kid. It is, and we got to be careful with that. You're exactly right with grading, because anecdotal doesn't work. Okay, that much. Okay, it's not fair to everybody because everybody has inherent biases about something. Okay,
right.
Like if a kid mouthed off to you or something like that, that has nothing to do with if the kid is learning. I mean, it's just really, really important. And I have to ask you this: how are you doing when you talk to college professors about this? They were when I was in school, they were omnipotent. Nobody would say a word to them. And what little I know about higher ed, I'm not an expert in it by any stretch of the imagination. They're pretty much independent, so to speak. All right, in terms of how they grade, et cetera. When you talk to a university or a college, what's going on with them?
Yeah, I mean, it's really very similar. I mean, they actually get even less training than the middle school.
They get none sometimes. They're just historians or chemists. Yeah,
that's
they
right.
None.
And, they have different levels of interest in teaching anyway. But what we find often is that the teachers, faculty are really invited to be part of this. There's no requirement oftentimes because they just can't require them to attend professional development. But when they're exposed and sort of invited and some of this information is kind of teased with them, they come and there's resistance and all kinds of the similar things we get from K-12, but they are really hungry for this research also. And what's interesting is that they become really interested in the research aspects of it. Like, I'm a historian, let's say. I had no idea that the motivation research that's been going on in the last 40 years is actually pushing away from how I grade, right? I had no idea because I didn't even know motivation research. And now you're telling me about this motivation research. It's really interesting to me. Oh, I'm going to stop giving them points for everything because the motivation research is saying that's the exact opposite thing to do to motivate students.
Right. It's really amazing. And, you said it before, some of them don't even know how to teach. Okay. And the difference is, remember, we call a teacher. Their good job is to teach. Okay, but a professor is up there to profess. Okay, just expound knowledge. That's the basis of it. Okay, we name it like that. Okay, but the truth of the matter is they have to work at teaching too, because if the kids aren't learning, you're not teaching. That's one of my favorite lines, and we have to be careful about that. What's your next book? We got to go in a few minutes, but what's your next book?
Well,
what are you working on?
The book was originally published. Grading for Equity was published in 2018, and with the pandemic, I think we learned a whole lot more about why it's so important to grade more equitably. I mean, what we were seeing is that large numbers of students were getting D's and F's because of the way that remote learning was happening and all of the trauma that so many students and their teachers were experiencing.
Yeah,
and I think what it did is it really heightened our understanding, or at least awareness, that we've got to do something different in the ways that we grade, because it is really so ineffective and even harming students. Yeah. And so I think the new edition of the book, Grading for Equity, it just came out about a week ago. And in it,
congratulations. Congratulations.
Thanks. In the book, I spent some time talking about what the pandemic taught us and what the Black Lives Matter movement also sort of helped us better understand about our grading. And then there's also a chapter that I add around how to create system-wide change. So you can't just have an individual teacher improve what they do to be more equitable in their grading. You have to think about how a system like a school or a district can have equitable grading system-wide for the reasons you talked about. And how do you help teachers come to some coherence around it when grading has been this very protective activity? So we talk about how in our work with districts and universities and other systems, how we help teachers build up a consensus and a body of evidence in their context that warrants full policy changes across the system, because that becomes so important for the institutions.
And so important for the kids. And so important for the kids. I mean, it's just, wow, it's just amazing. Joe, this has been fascinating. I got to tell you, Joe Feldman is CEO of the Crescendo Education Group. I have it linked. It's crescendoedgroup.org. And I got to tell you, I learned something today. Joe, this is fascinating. I hope we can do more together.
That would be great. Thanks for the invitation, Larry. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Okay, continue good fortune. Everything's good, and good luck with the new edition. I hope a lot of people get it.
Thanks.
You're welcome. You take care. Okay, and enjoy. You got the whole day ahead of you. I'm here in Maine. I'm coming up to lunchtime. Okay.
Good.
Enjoy breakfast. I'll talk to you. Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much.
All right.
Bye-bye. Great. Joe Feldman, everybody. Please check it out. This is really, really important stuff. Okay, crescendoedgroup.org. And his book is Grading for Equity. Now, there's a second edition out there. Wow, incredible. Wow, I'm speechless. And that's not good because I'm doing a podcast. We're going to archive the show over at ace-ed.org. And if you need me, Larry at ace-ed.org. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Joe.